our package on page 7, and Mr. Ford will have you highlight this for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't propose to go through all the discussion and analysis that's in here. I think a number of the items that are discussed here we talked about with Mr. O'Donnell in terms of how the financial statements are prepared and what the differences are between now and then. I'd just like to add an additional comment about the taxes receivable. And one of the things that I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I can certainly get them for council, and I think they're in our business plan actually. The number it's on page 4, I got to find it now. I think it's about $1.5 million lower. Right, it's 10.9 versus 12.5. It's about $1.5 million lower. If you take a look at that and drill down into it, you'll see that what's happening is that the arrears taxes, and by arrears I mean something that's 1 year, not current. Right now we have 2014 is considered current, 2013 and back is considered arrears. If you go and look at 2013, you'll see that the current year taxes are significantly higher than the 2012 current year taxes a year ago. And what that tells us is that the current taxes are not being addressed. The current year's taxes are not being addressed, and I think that may have some things to deal with economy and things of that nature. But when you look at the arrears taxes, those numbers are dropping significantly. I think if you take a look at the arrears, I think our arrears from 2012 to 2013 or 2012 to 2014 are down almost $5 million. But it's lost in the shuffle here because the current year portion is up because of a number of economic impacts. So the number is, the gross number, the macro number is lower, which is really good news. But when you start taking it apart and see that the current year component of it is starting to, not even starting, it's going up considerably, and the arrears are coming down substantially. So that's the difference. And the net is $1.5 million. I'm very pleased to hear Mr. O'Donnell talk about reserves and reserve funds. Those are my favorite topics. We will continue to be providing discussion when the 2015 budget's being prepared in terms of ramping up those contributions to reserves. There was a discussion about the accumulated surplus that's on page 18, I think, and one of the items in there is the current operating surplus. We will be presenting a report to council after the break, probably might not be in August, but certainly it will be in September in terms of what the disposition is that we propose of those funds. And there'll be some discussion then in terms of how that number is accumulated and what it means and what we suggest that we do with it. So other than those very brief comments, I think most of the things that Mr. O'Donnell talked about and the questions that Council asked during his presentation, those items were referenced in my report, but they were also covered verbally. So if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Questions to Mr. Ford. Councilor Chanyi.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, rather than ask a question, I just want to pick one line from the report that I think is very, very important. And that line is, current legislation requires that municipalities must have balanced budgets. Could you elaborate on that, Mr. Ford, please?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. That reference that comes out of regulations under the Municipal Act, and what basically it means is that we can't budget for a surplus and we can't budget for a deficit. The total amount of money that the way the regulation actually reads, as it comes at it from the back end, is that we're required to provide for all of the monies we need to pay all of the bills, including all of the loans, encumbrances, and I think the words to that effect, almost a quote. And less whatever the revenues is, and I believe they refer to the residual as being the amount to come from taxes. So the taxes plus the revenue for other purposes has to equal the amount of money that we need to run the business. And that's what it meant by balanced budgeting. Total revenue, total expenses, bottom line is zero. We can't budget for a surplus, we can't budget for a deficit.
Thank you for that explanation, because I think somewhere out there in the ether, or wherever, there is a misconception about what can and can't be done. You hear some stories that, oh, Norfolk County's in trouble, they look like Detroit, you know, all of these things. But once again, we just heard the consolidated financial report, and it looks good. And we also have legislation that says we can't get into trouble. We have to work towards the balanced budget. So thank you for that explanation, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Robicheau?
I'm glad Councilor Chanyi raised that. In fact, there was, I think, a very mean-spirited blog last year that took something out of our statements that was a way of presentation that perhaps was open to abuse. If you turn to pages 22 and 23 of the financial statements, the presentation of the segmented information that's shown on pages 22 and 23 of the statements is changed this year. Last year, where you see now deficiency of revenue over expenses for the year financed by the net municipal levy, that just used to be called, on the segmented information, deficit. And someone in a mean-spirited way took, for example, if you see last year, there was a deficiency of revenue, direct revenues related to transportation services of $26 million that had to be funded from the levy. That was budgeted for. But last year, someone took that and said, look at that, they've got a deficit in their road operations of $26 million, which wasn't true. In fact, that was just the amount that had to be financed from the municipal tax levy, and was. So if you see, the presentation of that segmented information has been changed for this year. I did request that, and the auditors have done that. And so you'll see that, in fact, each of the areas, there are own source or specific source revenues for those areas. Then there's the expenses of the areas, and then there's an amount that has to be funded from the municipal tax levy. And you go across and you see that, in fact, the amount that has to be funded across all of those segmented areas for protective, transportation, environmental, social, and other services is $61,583,000. The tax revenue was $69,334,000, and you get that same annual surplus figure of $7.7 million. So I think, Councilor Chanyi, that's one of the things you were addressing, and I appreciate the opportunity to provide that clarification, and we've made that change in the presentation of the statements.
Thank you, Mr. Robicheau. Any other questions from committee on this report? Councillor Black?
Wanted to move the recommendation, Mr.
Thank you
Chair.
very much. Anyone else? Mayor Trevally?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to pick up on a comment that Mr. Ford made about the reserve funds. And after the summer break, sometime in September, bringing forward a report. For some time now, the county manager and I and Mr. Ford have been talking about the new financial system that's coming in that will bring efficiencies. We've been talking about rebalancing all of the reserve and reserve funds relative to those that have perhaps excess money in them for the need, and moving that to the ones that have a greater need, perhaps, like roads. And my question through you to either the county manager or to Mr. Ford would be, does senior staff have the ability to reshuffle that deck, or do they need to come to council to do that?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, in some cases, because of the nature of the reserve fund, council may have to approve it. In case of some of the reserves, there may be discretion for the staff to do it. However, let me put a stake in the ground to say that staff would not make any of those transfers without council's authorization, whether it's required because of the the nature of the reserve fund, or whether it's something that's more of I'll put it in quotation marks, an ad hoc reserve, I would never even contemplate doing that without council knowledge and approval of it. Some of them require a different approach because of the nature of the reserve fund. And we will spell that all out to council when it comes time for that, for the rebalancing as Mayor Trevally is talking about.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councilor Black has moved that report FS 1425, that's the 2013 audited financial statement report, be received as information, and further that this consolidated financial statement for 2013 for Norfolk County be received. Discussion on that recommendation. Hearing none, those in favor, that is carried. And Mr. Ford and Mr. O'Donnell, again, all your hard work is very much appreciated. I would like to move on in presentations to our next presentation.